The champagne glass trembled in my hand when my son lifted his and laughed. Let's thank the old hag who paid for everything he said. 200 guests roared with laughter. My heart didn't. For 32 years, I'd given Daniel everything college, his first apartment, this six-figure wedding. And now, under the glittering chandeliers I'd paid for, he turned me into a joke. His beautiful bride, Emily, smiled beside him, the picture of triumph. They thought they'd won. But what Daniel didn't know, what no one in that room knew, was that his late father, Richard, had left behind a clause in his will. A single sentence hidden deep in the legal pages waiting for this very moment. A sentence that could take everything Daniel had and hand it to someone else entirely. As the laughter echoed around me, I set my glass down, reached into my purse, and felt the cool edge of the sealed envelope I'd carried for 15 years. Before we toast, I said, my voice steady, "Your father has something to add." And when I broke that red wax seal, I knew by the end of the night, no one in that room would ever laugh again. My name is Margaret Holt, though most people call me Maggie. I'm 68 years old, a widow for 15 years, and for most of my life, I've been defined by one title, Daniel's mother. After my husband Richard passed, I took over his small construction business and somehow managed to keep it alive through sheer will and a lot of sleepless nights. I paid off the debts, sold my jewelry, and built a modest but steady company, all so my son could have every opportunity we never did. I thought that was love. I thought it would be enough. That afternoon, I sat in the front row of the grand ballroom of the Hamilton Hotel, surrounded by 200 guests dressed in their finest. The air smelled of roses and champagne of money. Well spent, my money to be exact. I had covered everything: the flowers, the 10-piece jazz band, the filet mignon dinner, the open bar, the champagne tower, even the string quartet that played as Emily, my soon-to-be daughter-in-law, walked down the aisle. $75,000 in total. I didn't blink at the cost because it was for Daniel, my only child, the last piece of Richard I had left. I wore a simple navy dress I'd sewn myself, nothing fancy, but something that made me feel dignified. On my lap sat my old leather purse worn at the corners, the kind of purse that had lived through decades of grocery lists and business receipts. Inside was an envelope I hadn't opened in 15 years, a yellowed packet sealed with red wax, the edges frayed from being touched too many times. It contained Richard's last will and testament. I had promised myself I would never need to look at it again. But as the music swelled and Daniel kissed his bride, a quiet unease settled in my chest, like a storm waiting beyond the horizon. The reception glowed with laughter and crystal light. Waiters glided between tables, carrying silver trays. Emily looked radiant. She had that effortless confidence that comes from being adored. Daniel looked happy, or maybe just proud. He had always been charming when eyes were on him, something he inherited from Richard. For a while, I let myself be proud too. My son, successful, handsome, newly married. A moment that should have been pure joy. Then came the toasts. I should have seen it coming, the way he took the microphone with that smug grin, a few glasses of champagne in his arm around Emily's waist, the way she leaned into him, her smile bright, rehearsed. He started by thanking everyone, the guests, the venue, the florist, even the band. Then he turned toward me. "I want to thank the person who made this all possible," he said, his voice carrying easily across the ballroom. "My mother, the old hag, who paid for everything." There was a pause just long enough for the words to land like a slap across my face, and then the room erupted in laughter. 200 people laughed. Some politely, others wholeheartedly, as if it were the funniest thing they'd ever heard. Emily laughed too, clinging to his arm, pretending to shush him, but her eyes sparkled with mischief. My fingers tightened around the stem of my champagne glass. I could feel it trembling in my hand. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears. The word hag echoed again and again in my mind, each repetition sharper than the last. I had given him everything, every dollar, every hour of my youth, every piece of myself, and now in front of a ballroom full of people, I was a punchline. Someone touched my shoulder. It was Helen, my closest friend, who'd known me since college. She leaned close and whispered, "Maggie, Daniel doesn't know." "Does he? About what Richard left in the will?" I didn't answer. My throat was too tight. I just shook my head slowly. Across the room, on a side table draped in white lace, was a small framed photo of Richard and me on our wedding day, 1985. He was smiling in that steady, knowing way he always did. For a second, I could almost imagine his eyes flicking toward me as if to say, "You know what to do." The laughter began to fade, replaced by the clinking of glasses, the hum of conversation. Daniel moved on to the next part of his speech, oblivious to the silence building in my chest. My fingers unclenched from the glass, and I placed it carefully on the table. I could feel Helen watching me, waiting for me to crumble, but I didn't. I sat straighter, smoothed the skirt of my dress, and opened my purse. The envelope was there exactly where it had been for 15 years. My hands trembled as I pulled it out, the faint crack of old wax filling the air between us. I traced the imprint of Richard's initials, RJH, and felt something shift inside me. For years I had protected Daniel from the truth, from consequences, from the hardness of life. But as I looked at that envelope, I realized Richard had been protecting me from this very moment. Helen's voice was barely a whisper. "Maggie, what are you doing?" I closed my hand around the envelope. My voice was calm, almost steady. Something I should have done a long time ago. And as Daniel raised his glass again, laughing with his new wife, I felt the weight of Richard's promise in my hand. By the time the night was over, I knew no one in that ballroom would ever laugh at me again. The last words I'd said in that ballroom still echoed in my mind, something I should have done a long time ago. That night, when I finally got home, I sat alone in my living room with my purse still on my lap, the sealed envelope heavy inside it, like a secret waiting to breathe. The laughter from the wedding still rang faintly in my ears, mingled with the dull ache of humiliation that wouldn't fade, no matter how many times I told myself to be calm. I wasn't angry, not yet. Anger was too sharp, too young. What I felt was something slower, heavier, like grief with teeth. The house was quiet, too quiet. It always was since Richard died, but that night, it felt emptier than ever. I set the envelope on the table in front of me and just stared at it for a while. 15 years. I'd carried it through every holiday, every birthday, every lonely evening when I'd sit by the window waiting for Daniel to call. I'd read the first few lines once before and couldn't bear to continue. Richard had told me near the end that there was something inside that would protect me if Daniel ever lost his way. I'd laughed through my tears and said, "Protect me from our son. Oh, Richard, he adores me." He hadn't argued, just looked at me with that quiet, steady expression of his, the same one he had when he knew I was wrong, but loved me too much to say it. I remember the day he wrote that will as clearly as if it were yesterday. It was spring of 2010, and the dogwoods outside Harold Pierce's office were in bloom. Richard sat by the window, pale and thin, the sickness already eating at him. His once broad shoulders seemed to have folded in on themselves. He tried to joke about it. 53 isn't old enough to make a will, is it? But his voice trembled on the word will. Harold, who'd been our family's lawyer, and Richard's college roommate didn't answer. He just handed Richard a pen and waited. I sat across from them holding Richard's scarf, watching the man I'd loved for 30 years make preparations to leave me behind. When Harold asked why he wanted such a detailed clause about Daniel, Richard's eyes had gone distant. "Because I've seen what greed can do to a man," he said quietly. "You remember my brother Harold. You saw what he did to our mother." I didn't know all the details then, just fragments of that old family shame, but Richard told them that day. How his brother Thomas had tricked their mother into signing over her property, how he'd put her in a nursing home, and never visited how she'd died there alone. "She worshipped him," Richard said, his voice cracking. "And he humiliated her to the end. I can't let that happen to Maggie." Harold nodded, already writing. "Then let's make sure it never does." The clause was written that afternoon line by line while I sat silently by the window and tried not to cry. It was so precise, so coldly logical, yet full of love in its own strange way. Richard dictated, "All assets, properties, and investments shall pass to my beloved wife, Margaret Ann Holt, for her lifetime use. Upon her death, all remaining assets shall transfer to our son, Daniel Richard Holt, provided that he has demonstrated continued respect, care, and support for his mother throughout her lifetime." He paused, then looking at Harold. "Make sure that word respect is clear. Not just care. Respect." Harold added it without a word. I didn't understand at the time why Richard needed to make it so formal. I thought he was overreacting, projecting his old wounds onto our son. When he mentioned the second part about the executor's judgment based on public actions and witness testimony, I almost protested. It felt cruel, unnecessary. Richard caught my hand, his eyes tired but burning with conviction. "I have to do this, Maggie. If I don't, I'll die wondering whether I've left you safe or vulnerable. Promise me you'll keep this clause. And promise me you won't tell Daniel until you have to." I promised, and I kept that promise for 15 years. After Richard passed, Harold gave me the envelope sealed with red wax and Richard's initials and said softly, "Only to be opened if he ever forgets who you are." For years I believed I never would. Daniel was a good boy, thoughtful, affectionate. But people change. The world hardens them. Somewhere along the way, my son began to look at me not as his mother, but as an obstacle. Maybe Emily planted that seed. Maybe it was always there. I'll never know. Now, sitting in the dim light of my living room, I finally opened my purse and pulled out that envelope again. My hands trembled. The paper had yellowed, and the wax seal was cracked at the edge. I could almost hear Richard's voice beside me, calm, certain, protective. I pressed my thumb against the seal, feeling it give slightly under the warmth of my skin, and whispered, "You knew him better than I did, Richard." I took out my wallet and found the small photograph I always kept tucked inside, the one taken a few weeks before he died. Richard sat in the garden sunlight on his face, eyes bright and knowing, despite the sickness that had taken so much from him. I looked at that picture for a long time, tears blurring my vision. "You knew, didn't you?" I whispered. "You knew Daniel would become like Thomas if someone didn't guide him right. And I failed. I'm so sorry." The photo slipped from my fingers onto the table, landing beside the sealed will. I leaned back, listening to the soft hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the clock, the quiet house that once held laughter. For the first time, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, not grief, not guilt, but resolve. Richard had given me a way to protect myself, and I had ignored it out of love. Now, love wasn't enough. It was time to keep the promise I'd made him. That promise became a weight on my chest as I sat there staring at Richard's photograph, trying to remember the woman I used to be before life turned into survival. Sometimes I think that promise, the one to protect myself if Daniel ever forgot who I was, wasn't really for Richard at all. It was for the part of me that had once believed love alone could hold a family together. When Richard died in 2010, I was 53 and utterly unprepared to live without him. He'd been gone only a week when clients began calling the office to cancel contracts. They said they were reassessing their partnerships after the company's founder passed. I knew what that meant. They didn't trust a grieving widow to run a construction firm. I remember sitting behind Richard's old desk that first morning, staring at blueprints that looked like another language. The smell of his aftershave still clung to the air, and I cried so hard I had to press a handkerchief to my mouth to muffle the sound. But that afternoon, I made coffee, wiped my face, and started reading. Every manual, every invoice, every project file. I didn't know what a load-bearing wall was, but I was going to find out. Daniel was 17, then tall, bright, full of energy and planning for college. He wanted Yale, and Richard had wanted that for him too. The tuition was $60,000 a year, more money than I'd ever seen in one place. I sold the diamond ring Richard gave me when he proposed, the one I'd worn every day for 30 years. It fetched $45,000. I told Daniel I'd refinance the house instead. I didn't want him to feel guilty. The day he left for college, I waved until his bus disappeared around the corner, then came home and sat in the quiet kitchen, staring at the mark on my finger where the ring used to be. The business took everything I had. I was up most nights studying contracts and invoices, teaching myself to navigate what Richard had always handled with ease. I met with clients, negotiated bids, visited construction sites, wearing steel-toed boots that blistered my feet. I learned to hide the exhaustion behind a smile. Slowly, we stabilized. The first year I broke even. The next, we made a small profit. By the time Daniel graduated in 2014, I was running a respectable mid-sized firm with 10 employees. I remember sewing him a navy blue suit for his commencement because I couldn't afford to buy one from a tailor. I stayed up 3 nights hand-stitching the hem. When I saw him walking across that stage, proud and strong, I thought, Richard, we did it. He made it. For a long time, Daniel was everything I hoped he'd be: attentive, kind, ambitious, without arrogance. He'd call me every Sunday visit on holidays, ask for my advice about jobs and women. I thought we were close. I thought I'd raised him right. But love has blind spots. And I didn't see the distance forming until it was too late. He met Emily in 2022. He was 29, working as a financial analyst, making 6 figures a year, living in a sleek apartment in the city, the one I helped him buy by covering 30% of the down payment. When he called to tell me he'd met someone special, his voice carried that same youthful excitement I remembered from when he was a boy. I was happy for him. Genuinely. He'd earned his success, and I wanted him to have a partner who appreciated it. The first time I met Emily, she was polished, poised, and polite. Too polite. Her smile didn't reach her eyes, but Daniel adored her, and that was enough for me. Or so I told myself. Within 6 months, he began missing our Sunday calls. Then he skipped Thanksgiving, saying Emily's family invited us this year. I'd already roasted the turkey, set the table for 3. He sent a text on my 66th birthday. No call, just words on a screen. Happy birthday, Mom. Busy with work. Will call soon. The call never came. I told myself it was just the natural pull of adulthood, the way sons drift away when new women enter their lives. But the truth felt heavier. It wasn't just distance. It was replacement. The night I realized how deep that change went was in October 2023. Daniel had texted me that morning saying he wasn't feeling well, so I decided to surprise him with homemade chicken soup. It was raining, a cold, steady drizzle, the kind that seeps through your coat, no matter how fast you walk. When I got to his apartment, the lights were off. I knocked. No answer. I tried the key he'd given me years ago, it still worked. Inside, the air smelled of expensive candles and silence. I found him asleep in the bedroom, feverish, the blanket barely covering him. I smiled softly, relieved he was resting. I was about to leave the soup on the counter when I heard a voice. Emily's voice. It came from down the hall, faint but clear through the half-open door of the study. "Trust me, babe," she was saying, her tone casual, almost bored. "Once the old lady's gone, the house, the company shares, everything will be ours. He's an only child. No siblings to split with. We just need to wait it out. Maybe encourage her to think about assisted living, for her safety." For a moment, I couldn't move. The world narrowed to the sound of her voice and the steam rising from the soup cup in my hand. My heart thudded in my ears. I looked at my son, my baby boy sleeping peacefully, unaware of what she was planning. The air felt too thick to breathe. I set the soup down on the counter, my fingers burning from the heat, and walked out as quietly as I could. By the time I reached my car, the rain had turned into a downpour. I sat there, gripping the steering wheel, staring at my reflection in the rearview mirror, water streaking down the glass like tears. I didn't recognize the woman looking back at me, tired-lined, hollow-eyed. For 15 years, I had carried our family alone. Now all I could think was, did I raise him wrong, or did she change him? And worse, what would Richard do if he were here to see this? That question stayed with me for months, haunting every quiet moment. I kept turning it over in my mind as if somehow, by imagining what Richard would have done, I could steady myself. But the truth was, I didn't need Richard's voice to tell me what was happening. I could see it clearly now, the slow erosion of love, the deliberate twisting of trust. It was happening right in front of me, and the woman behind it was Emily Ross. After that night, I began to notice things I hadn't seen before, or maybe things I'd chosen not to see. Emily was clever. She never attacked me outright. Instead, she chipped away at Daniel's image of me piece by piece, quietly, systematically. She started small, almost kindly. "Your mom seemed tired last week, didn't she?" she'd say when I saw them together. "I think she might be overworking herself." I brushed it off at first, but the comments kept coming more frequent, more insidious. "Your mom asked me the same question twice the other day. Do you think her memory's slipping a little? Or that house of hers has such steep stairs. If she ever fell, Daniel, it could be catastrophic. Maybe she should look into one of those retirement communities near the lake. They're so safe." At first, I thought I was being paranoid. Daniel would visit, and I'd catch him glancing around my kitchen like he was assessing danger. Once he frowned at the throw rug near the sink and said, "Mom, this is a tripping hazard. You should get rid of it." He sounded so clinical, so detached, that I just laughed. "I've managed to stay upright for 68 years, I told him. "I think I'll be fine." But his expression didn't soften. That was when I realized he wasn't joking. From late 2022 through the following year, Emily's quiet campaign gained ground. I'd find pamphlets about senior living options on my dining table after their visits, left there no doubt by accident. One day, Daniel brought over groceries, and tucked among them, I found a bottle of supplements labeled Memory Boost Formula for Seniors. When I asked about it, he said gently, "Just thought it couldn't hurt, Mom." I wanted to scream. I wanted to ask him if he really believed his mother, who still managed a full-time business, balanced books, and remembered every one of his childhood birthdays, was losing her mind. But I didn't. I smiled, thanked him, and added the bottle to the growing pile of quiet humiliations I kept hidden in the back of my pantry. By mid-2023, the distance between us had hardened into something unrecognizable. My phone calls went to voicemail. When he did answer, his voice was clipped, distracted. Texts from him became brief. Okay, busy later. Once I invited them both to dinner to mark 15 years since Richard's passing. I cooked his favorite meal, pot roast, mashed potatoes, green beans with almonds, and set 3 plates at the table. I even lit a candle for Richard like I always did. Hours passed and they never showed. At 8:30, my phone buzzed. Can't make it. Emily has a work event. Maybe next year. The candle flickered until it burned itself out. I ate alone. The food had gone cold by the time I finished. I began to understand that Emily wasn't just manipulative, she was strategic. She didn't want Daniel to hate me outright. She wanted him to pity me, to see me as fragile, fading someone he could control. And it worked. He started talking to me like I was a child. You should really think about the future, Mom, he'd say. You can't live in that old house forever. When I protested, his voice would sharpen. I'm just trying to help. Then came December 2024. I remember the morning, vividly gray skies, the smell of snow in the air. I'd decided to deliver their Christmas gifts early since Daniel had said they wouldn't make it home for the holidays. I arrived at their apartment unannounced, carrying a basket of cookies and a small wrapped box for each of them. Emily wasn't there, she'd left for work, and Daniel was in the shower. I set the basket on the counter and looked around, noticing how pristine everything was, almost sterile. That was when I saw it. On the desk in the corner of the living room lay a stack of papers neatly clipped together. The top page was labeled in bold Property Transfer Agreement, 247 Maple Street. My address, my home. I froze, eyes scanning the document. Seller Margaret A. Holt. Beneath it, in the space labeled Buyer, Authorized Representative, was Daniel's signature, dated and neat. Attached to the file was a pink sticky note in a handwriting I recognized instantly. Emily's. It read, "Get Mom to sign before end of Q1. Use safety concern angle. House value $850K, our future." For a long moment, I couldn't breathe. The paper blurred before my eyes. My hands shook so violently that I almost dropped my phone when I lifted it to take a picture. But I did. I needed proof, not that anyone else would need to see it, but so I could never doubt what I'd witnessed. My son had already signed to sell my house. All that was missing was my name at the bottom. I heard the water stop in the bathroom. My heart leapt, but I forced myself to stay calm. I set the papers back exactly as I'd found them and left quietly, closing the door without a sound. The cold morning air hit me like a slap. When I got into my car, I gripped the steering wheel and looked down at the photo on my phone, the evidence, the betrayal, the handwriting of the woman who'd stolen my son's heart, and apparently his conscience. I whispered almost to myself, "So this is your plan, Emily. You want to play games?" I glanced at the worn envelope still tucked inside my purse, its red wax seal glinting faintly in the winter light. Fine. But you don't know who you're playing against, and you don't know what Richard left behind. But even as I said them, I didn't know that part of what Richard had left behind was already in my son's hands, had been for years. I had no idea that Daniel had already found the secret I thought only I knew. Looking back, I can trace the beginning of everything to one quiet January afternoon in 2022, months before Emily appeared when Daniel came home to visit. He'd told me he needed to stop by and look through some old company files for a client. I was on my way out to the grocery store, and I remember tossing him the keys, saying, "Check your father's old desk if you need the archives. There might be something useful there." I didn't think much of it. That desk had been Richard's domain once now. It was where I handled paperwork for the company. To me, it was just a relic of another life. When I came home later that evening, Daniel was gone, but the office door stood open. Everything looked just as I'd left it. I didn't notice that one drawer, the bottom right one, was slightly ajar. I didn't know that he'd struggled to pull it open, or that when he did something had slipped from the back and landed on the floor, a yellow envelope sealed with Richard's unmistakable handwriting across the front. Daniel, to be opened only when you're ready to be a man. If you read this too soon, you'll resent me. If you read this too late, you'll regret it. I can imagine how those words must have stirred something in him. Curiosity, pride, maybe even defiance. At 29, Daniel had a good job, a city apartment, and the self-assurance of someone who thought he'd already arrived. I picture him sitting at my husband's old desk, turning that envelope over in his hands, deciding that yes, he was ready. He was a man now. Inside was a copy of Richard's will, the same one I'd guarded all these years. I didn't know it then, but that moment changed everything. Daniel read through it once, twice, and when he reached the clause, the line about respect and care for his mother, the forfeiture of inheritance. If he failed, he must have felt it like a slap. Richard's handwriting was meticulous, his tone gentle but firm. For Daniel, it must have felt like a judgment from beyond the grave. He had grown up hearing stories about Richard's brother Thomas, the uncle he never met, the one who'd broken their mother's heart for money. I'd told those stories myself, thinking they were cautionary tales about greed. But when Daniel read that clause, I think something in him twisted. Maybe he thought his father was comparing him to Thomas. Maybe he felt betrayed by the idea that his love needed to be measured, verified, proven. If I close my eyes, I can almost hear the words he must have whispered. Then Dad didn't trust me. I can picture his jaw tightening, that familiar Holt pride rising up. For years, Daniel had believed he was the good son, the dutiful one. The will turned that belief on its head. He must have sat there for a long time staring at that paper, feeling the weight of Richard's expectations pressing down on him. But pride is a dangerous thing. It rarely allows room for humility. Somewhere in that silence, another voice would have crept in, one I know too well from my own years of justifying, excusing, pretending. She'd never actually use it. That's what he must have told himself. Mom loves me too much. She wouldn't take anything from me, not even if I failed. Dad was paranoid. He was dying, and he overthought everything. He took out his phone and snapped a picture of the document every page. Then he slid everything back into the envelope, tucked it neatly behind the drawer, and walked away. When I came home that night, I asked him if he'd found what he needed for work. He smiled and said, "Yeah, thanks, Mom." I never noticed the flicker of something else behind his eyes. Guilt, maybe, or the start of a secret. Months passed before Emily appeared in his life. She arrived like a gust of wind, sharp and intoxicating. I met her briefly that summer, and I remember thinking how quickly Daniel seemed to revolve around her. What I didn't know was that not long after, she would discover the photograph on his phone. It must have happened one evening in September. Daniel once told me Emily had a habit of scrolling through their shared photos while they watched TV. I can imagine her lying beside him laughing at some picture from a beach trip, and then with one careless swipe, the image appearing on screen, last will and testament of Richard James Holt. "What's this, babe?" she probably asked, curiosity turning into calculation as her eyes scanned the text. Daniel must have laughed awkwardly, brushing it off. It's nothing he would have said, just Dad being overprotective. Mom would never actually use it. But Emily wasn't the kind of woman to ignore something like that. I didn't see her face then, but I can picture the glint in her eye as the words sank in, the realization that love, inheritance, and power were all tangled together in a single sentence written 15 years ago. She must have waited a moment, playing the part of the affectionate fiancée, before leaning in and whispering something soft enough to sound harmless, but sharp enough to plant a seed. Your mom's bluffing Daniel. Would any mother really cut off her only child, especially one like yours who's devoted her entire life to you? He wanted to believe her. It's easier to trust flattery than reflection. And later, when the lights were off and the room was quiet, she probably spoke again, her voice low and coaxing. You know what we should do. We should test her. Not in a mean way, just to prove that real love is unconditional. If she truly loves you, she'll forgive anything. If only I'd known then what they were planning to test. If only I'd realized that the first crack in my son's heart had already begun long before the laughter at his wedding ever reached my ears. But by the time that laughter finally did come, I was no longer surprised. A part of me had been expecting it, bracing for it, ever since the morning I saw that pink sticky note with Emily's handwriting. Still knowing didn't make it hurt less. Some betrayals you can't prepare for, no matter how strong you think you've become. The wedding planning began that February. They'd gotten engaged just before Christmas at a Michelin-starred restaurant where Daniel had reserved a private room and ordered a bottle of champagne that cost more than my first car. He told me afterward that the ring alone had set him back $15,000. I congratulated him, smiled, and tried not to think about how much of that money had once come from me. I was happy for him, or at least I wanted to be. But I saw something in Emily's eyes that day, a glint of satisfaction that wasn't about love. It was about victory. When the planning began, I tried to stay out of it. I told them I would contribute what I could, but that the details were theirs to decide. Emily took that as permission to turn every modest idea into a grand production. Maggie, she said one afternoon, her voice light as sugar, the standard floral package looks cheap. You don't want people thinking we cut corners, do you? Premium roses are only $8,000 more. I nodded and wrote the check. A week later, it was the photographer. 6 hours of coverage wasn't enough. They needed 10. Then the venue another 10,000 to move up the waiting list. Each time she said it, with that same sweet smile, as though she were doing me a favor by letting me pay. By April, the total had reached $75,000. I knew exactly how much because I kept every receipt in a small folder, though I never once mentioned the number aloud. Every time I signed a check, I told myself, this was what mothers did. They gave and hoped it was enough to buy their children's happiness. But deep down, I think I knew it wasn't happiness being purchased. It was control. On the morning of the wedding, I woke before dawn. The hotel suite was quiet, except for the distant hum of the city below. I slipped into the navy dress I'd made myself a habit I never lost, even when I could afford better, and pinned the small locket of Richard's photo to the inside of my purse. Inside that purse was also the yellow envelope, its red wax seal still unbroken. I had carried it for 15 years through every trial and doubt. That morning I told myself it was only a precaution, that I wouldn't need it, that Daniel would prove me wrong, that my son was still the boy who used to hold my hand when he crossed the street. The ceremony was beautiful. Too beautiful. It looked like something from a magazine, white roses everywhere, gold-edged dinnerware, the scent of money woven through every detail. I smiled through the photographs, the speeches, the endless congratulations. When Emily walked down the aisle, she was radiant. When Daniel kissed her, I felt a strange ache in my chest that wasn't jealousy or pride, but something in between, a mother's realization that she was no longer the center of her son's world. Dinner passed in a blur of clinking glasses and polite laughter. The first dance came, then the cake cutting. I remember thinking how tired Daniel looked, how forced his smile seemed. But when he stood up for his toast, I knew something was wrong the moment he took the microphone. His movements were loose, unsteady, his cheeks flushed from champagne. Emily touched his arm lightly, deliberately, as if reminding him of something. everyone, he called out, voice loud and cheerful. Everyone, I just want to take a moment to thank the people who made this day possible. The crowd applauded. First, my beautiful wife, Emily Moore, applause, laughter. He grinned, looked down at her, and then turned toward me. I could see the flicker of hesitation in his eyes, the last moment he could have stopped himself. But he didn't. And of course, he said, his grin widening, I can't forget my mother, the old hag who paid for everything. Let's give her a round of applause. The room erupted. 200 people laughing, glasses raised, flashes from cameras capturing every second. Some guests chuckled awkwardly, unsure whether it was a joke. Others laughed freely, eager to join in the performance. Emily smiled radiant, her hand still on his arm. For a moment, I couldn't move. My skin went cold, my vision blurred. I could hear my own heartbeat louder than the laughter around me. I thought of all the nights I'd stayed awake, balancing budgets to pay for his education, of the calloused fingers that had mended his clothes, of the ring I'd sold so he could go to Yale. And now I was an old hag. A punchline. But I didn't cry. I didn't run. Instead, I stood up. Slowly. The movement alone silenced the room. The laughter faded one voice at a time until you could have heard a pin drop. I reached into my purse and felt the familiar edges of the envelope. My hand didn't shake. My voice, when it came, was calm and steady. Daniel, I said softly, before everyone continues toasting, I think your father has something he would like to say to you. His smile faltered. Mom, what are you? This, I said, holding up the envelope so the gold seal caught the light, is a certified copy of your father's last will and testament, the one with a clause you may or may not know about. A murmur rippled through the room. I could see confusion, curiosity, discomfort. Emily's face drained of color. Maggie, you're being ridiculous, she shouted, her voice shrill, desperate. Put that away. I didn't even look at her. My eyes stayed on Daniel. Shall I read it aloud? I asked, my voice low even. Or would you prefer to do this privately? Daniel, I could feel 200 pairs of eyes on me as I stood there, the golden envelope in my hand catching the light from the chandeliers. The laughter that had filled the ballroom moments earlier had evaporated, leaving behind a heavy, uneasy silence. Even the band had stopped mid-note, the final chord of their jazz number hanging in the air like smoke. My son stood frozen, his champagne glass suspended halfway to his lips, his mouth slightly open, as though his brain hadn't yet caught up to his ears. I broke the seal. The wax gave with a soft crack, and for a moment it sounded to me like a bone snapping. I unfolded the page's thin, crisp legal paper, the ink slightly faded from age, and began to read. My voice, though quiet, carried through the room. I, Richard James Holt, being of sound mind and memory, do hereby declare this to be my last will and testament. I paused, my eyes flicking briefly to Daniel's face. He looked pale, his jaw tightening, his fingers flexing as if to snatch the document from my hands. I continued slower this time, my words deliberate. I leave all assets, properties, and investments to my beloved wife, Margaret Ann Holt, for her lifetime. Upon Margaret's death, all remaining assets shall transfer to our son, Daniel Richard Holt. The crowd seemed to relax a little, some guests exchanging relieved glances. For a moment, it must have sounded like any other will-predictable routine. But then I read the next line, and the silence deepened again. Provided that he has demonstrated continued respect, care, and support for his mother throughout her lifetime. A small gasp rippled through the room. A fork clinked against a plate somewhere to my left. I didn't stop. The determination of respect and care shall be made by the executor, Mr. Harold Pierce Esquire, based on documented evidence including but not limited to public statements, caregiving actions, and witness testimony. Should the executor determine that Daniel has failed to meet this standard, all assets shall instead transfer to the Holt Family Foundation, a charitable organization to be established. I lowered the page slightly, letting the words sink in. The silence that followed was absolute. I could hear someone in the back clear their throat, the faint hum of the air conditioning, even the soft creak of my chair as I stepped back from it. When I looked up again, Daniel's face was ghostly white. Emily's was red with fury. "Mom," Daniel stammered, his voice cracking slightly. "I was joking. Everyone here knows that's just—" He gestured helplessly toward the guests. "That's how I joke." "Right." His laugh was high-pitched, nervous, desperate. He turned to the audience, searching for allies, but the response was tepid at best. A few people gave weak, uncertain nods. Most avoided his gaze, staring down at their plates, their drinks anywhere but at him. Emily stepped forward, then her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. "This is insane," she said loudly, her voice trembling with rage. "You're humiliating us on our wedding day over a joke. This document is probably outdated or fake for all we know." Before I could respond, another voice cut through the tension. It was Helen, my oldest friend, standing from her chair near the front. "Emily," she said firmly, "I witnessed Richard sign that will. It's very real." Her words hung in the air like a verdict. A few guests began to stand whispering to each other, gathering their things. I saw one woman glance at me with sympathy, another with curiosity. The sound of chairs scraping the floor filled the space that laughter had occupied only minutes before. Daniel's eyes darted between me and Emily, panic creeping into his expression. "Mom," he said again, quieter. "Now, you don't really mean this. You're not actually going to—" He trailed off the words, dying in his throat. I took a breath, steadying my voice. "Daniel, I said your father loved you more than his own life. But he also loved me. And he knew, because he watched his own mother suffer, that real love doesn't humiliate. Real love doesn't turn someone into a joke for applause." I held his gaze as I spoke, not with anger, but with a heaviness I couldn't hide. I hoped for 15 years that I'd never have to use this document. I prayed you'd prove your father wrong. But tonight you proved him right. He tried to interrupt, but I raised a hand, silencing him. "When I die, Mr. Pierce will decide whether you deserve what your father built. And based on tonight—" I hesitated, feeling the ache in my chest, the weight of every sleepless night I'd spent wondering where I'd failed. "I don't think you will." A collective exhale moved through the crowd, the kind people make when they've just witnessed something they know they shouldn't have seen. I folded the document carefully and placed it on the table beside my untouched glass of champagne. The bubbles had gone flat, just like the laughter that had filled the room not 10 minutes before. I turned, lifted my chin, and began walking toward the exit. My heels clicked softly against the polished floor, the sound echoing in the cavernous ballroom. Behind me, I could hear whispers starting up again, hushed and frantic. Someone called my name, maybe Helen, but I didn't stop. I'd spent too many years standing still for this boy, this man who had forgotten what it meant to love without taking. "Mom." Daniel's voice broke through the noise, suddenly louder, raw. "Mom, please." "It was Emily's idea," she said. "Mom." But I didn't turn around. I kept walking until I reached the double doors at the back of the hall. I pushed them open, the hinges groaning softly, and stepped through. As they closed behind me, the sound of his voice was cut off completely, leaving only silence. And for the first time in years, that silence didn't scare me. It felt like freedom. But as I stepped into the cool night air outside the ballroom, that fragile sense of freedom quickly gave way to a deeper, quieter ache, one that no amount of silence could cover. I walked toward my car under the yellow glow of the hotel's awning lights, my heels clicking on the pavement, my body trembling, not from fear, but from exhaustion. The laughter, the music, the smell of champagne, all of it was fading behind me, collapsing into a blur. I didn't look back. I couldn't. By the time I reached home, midnight had come and gone. I kicked off my shoes at the door, left my purse on the counter, and sat in the dark living room without turning on a single light. My reflection in the window looked older than I remembered, tired-lined but strangely resolute. The house was silent, except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. I realized with a bitter smile that the silence that had felt like freedom was now just emptiness. Later, I learned from Helen what had happened after I left the wedding. She'd stayed for a few minutes, mostly out of loyalty, though she said the air inside that ballroom had turned so heavy it was almost unbearable. Guests left in small groups, murmuring awkward apologies as they passed her. First went my cousins and their families, good people who'd come to celebrate, but left ashamed. Then the friends who had known Richard and me since before Daniel was born. They told Helen they couldn't watch any longer, that it felt wrong to stay. By the time the band asked whether they should keep playing, Daniel had simply shaken his head. Within 45 minutes, 200 guests had dwindled to fewer than 30. I could picture it easily, the half-eaten prime rib, the lobster tails cooling in silver trays, the chocolate fountain stilled and crusted at the edges. Emily standing there in her immaculate white gown, bouquet in hand, her face twisted in something between fury and disbelief. The photographer, poor boy, had apparently approached her timidly to ask, "Do you still want the couple portraits?" To which she'd screamed, "Get out! Everyone, get out!" I could almost hear it in my mind, the shattering sound of her voice echoing in that vast, empty ballroom. Helen said Daniel hadn't moved for a long time after that. He'd sat at the head table with his head in his hands while the staff quietly cleared plates around him. She'd wanted to go to him to say something comforting, but then she remembered the look on my face when I left, the stillness in my voice. She told me later, "You didn't need me to console him, Maggie, not after what he did. He needed to sit in that mess and understand the weight of it." I didn't sleep that night. Around 2 a.m, I made myself a cup of tea I never drank and stared at the wedding invitation still pinned to the refrigerator door. Daniel and Emily, it read in gold cursive. Forever begins May 10th. I let out a dry laugh that startled me with how bitter it sounded. Forever had lasted exactly 5 hours. Around 11 that night, when I imagined Daniel and Emily were back in their bridal suite, my phone began to buzz. Once, then again, then over and over. I didn't pick it up. I couldn't bear to hear his voice, not yet. I watched the screen light up again and again on the coffee table, each notification another crack in the wall I was trying so hard to rebuild around myself. By midnight, there were 18 unread messages. "Mom, please call me. I'm sorry. Mom, please." 7 missed calls. I turned the phone face down. Helen texted once a simple message. "You did the right thing. Come over tomorrow. We'll have breakfast." Then my cousin, "Michael, proud of you, Maggie." He needed to hear it. I read their words and felt no pride, only a dull ache. There was no victory in what I'd done, only necessity. At some point, I must have dozed off on the couch. When I woke, morning light was filtering through the blinds, thin and gray. I got up, poured the cold tea down the sink, and made myself coffee. The house was still. For the first time, it felt too big for me. Every wall held a memory, Daniel's laughter as a boy, Richard humming in the kitchen, birthdays, Christmas mornings. Now those echoes felt like ghosts. I spent the next week avoiding the outside world. I didn't answer the phone, didn't go to the office, barely left the house. Helen came by with groceries and tried to get me to talk, but I couldn't. I had said everything I needed to say in that ballroom. The rest of it, the hurt, the guilt, the hollow ache was mine to carry. A week later, on Saturday evening, I went outside to tend the garden. The spring rain had made everything grow wild, and I needed the distraction of trimming and pulling weeds. The sun was low, the air cool and clean. My gloves were still damp from the soil when I heard the faint chime of my phone from the porch. I almost ignored it, another message from Daniel, no doubt, but something about the tone caught my attention. It was the email notification sound, one I rarely heard anymore. I wiped my hands on my apron, walked to the porch, and picked up the phone. The subject line made my breath catch. "You don't know who Emily really is," it read from someone who knew her mother. For a long moment, I stood there in the fading light, the phone heavy in my hand, my heart pounding in my chest. Whatever pain I'd felt before the humiliation, the loss, the heartbreak suddenly sharpened into something else entirely. Curiosity, fear, and maybe, just maybe, the beginning of an answer to a question I hadn't dared to ask until now. Who exactly had my son married? I stood on the porch, the glow of the phone screen lighting my trembling hands. My garden gloves were still streaked with dirt, and the night air had grown cold, but I couldn't make myself move. The subject line pulsed on the screen like a warning. I hesitated for a long time before finally opening the email. It came from an address that looked anonymous, truth-teller 917@protonmail.com. The message itself was brief, written in a tone that felt both urgent and careful. "Mrs. Holt, I'm a former social worker in the county. I saw your wedding incident on Facebook. Someone posted a video. I think you should know, Emily Ross is not her real name. She changed it legally in 2018. Her birth name is Rosa Martinez Jr. Her mother, Rosa Martinez Sr., worked as a housekeeper in your area around 2005. I can't say more for legal reasons, but you might want to check your old employment records. A friend." Attached to the message was a link name change petition, Rosa Maria Martinez Jr. to Emily Catherine Ross, filed 03/15/2018 County Clerk Office. My finger hovered over it, my breath shallow. When I finally clicked, the county record opened instantly. The file was real, official, and dated just as the email claimed. Name, date of birth, and signature all matched Emily's. I stared at the name Rosa Martinez Jr. for a long time, feeling a chill move up my spine. The name scratched at something deep in my memory, like a half-forgotten dream I didn't want to remember. And then it hit me. Rosa. I felt my legs weaken, and I had to sit down. My mind reached back 20 years to a time when the house had been full of life, when Richard was still alive, Daniel was 12, and we had a young housekeeper named Rosa Martinez. She'd been with us less than a year, a quiet woman from Mexico who worked harder than anyone I'd ever hired. She had a daughter, sweet, shy, around 8 or 9, who sometimes came along on weekends when Rosa couldn't find childcare. I remembered her little girl laughing in the garden with Daniel, both of them drenched after spraying each other with the hose. And then I remembered the day it all ended. I found myself running down to the basement, heart pounding, moving faster than I had in years. The air smelled of dust and cedar. I pulled open the cabinet where I'd stored years of household records, each box neatly labeled. Household 2000-2010. My fingers trembled as I tore through old folders. Gardener invoices, plumber receipts, tax statements, until I saw it, a thin yellow file marked Rosa Martinez, housekeeper employment. I sat right there on the cold concrete floor and opened it. My handwriting stared back at me from 15 years ago. Hired 09-2004. Terminated 06-2005 for theft allegation. Below that, I'd written 6/12/2005. Diamond necklace missing from jewelry box. Value $50 to $1,000. Richard's 20th anniversary gift. Rosa was only person with access to bedroom that week. Had to let her go immediately. Called police but didn't press charges because she has a young daughter. Felt terrible but can't risk more theft. The words blurred as I read them. I could see her face again in my memory. The tears, the way she'd fallen to her knees pleading, "Please, Mrs. Holt, I didn't take it. Please let me look again," and me, frightened, furious, more worried about the embarrassment of it all than the truth. "You need to leave," I'd said. Now. I'd never thought about her again after that. Not really. Just one of those unpleasant memories you bury under the comfort of thinking you did what was necessary. But now, with that email burning in my mind, I felt sick. I had to know. I rushed upstairs, climbed to the attic where I kept the old photo albums. I flipped through them frantically, page after page, until I found the summer of 2005. There it was, a photo of Daniel and Rosa's little girl, standing side by side in the garden, both laughing, both soaked to the skin. He was holding the hose spraying water into the air, and she was reaching out her head, tilted back sunlight catching her smile. I pulled out a magnifying glass and leaned in close. That's when I saw it, a small, heart-shaped birthmark just below her right ear. My hands began to shake. I opened my laptop, navigated to Facebook, and searched Daniel and Emily wedding. Someone had posted the professional photos publicly. I clicked through until I found one where Emily's head was turned slightly to the left, her hair swept back from her face. There, in the exact same spot, was that same heart-shaped mark. "Oh my God," I whispered. "Oh my God." It wasn't possible. But it was. The daughter of the woman I'd fired all those years ago, the woman I'd accused of stealing something she hadn't, was now my daughter-in-law. The woman who'd smiled at me, called me Maggie instead of Mom, who'd watched me write those checks for her perfect wedding, had been Rosa's little girl all along. I pressed a hand to my mouth trying to breathe, but another memory crashed over me like a wave. The year after I fired Rosa, when I was cleaning our bedroom to have it repainted, I'd found the missing diamond necklace. It had slipped behind the dresser. I remembered holding it in my hands, realizing what that meant, and feeling a moment of crushing guilt. I told myself it was too late to find her, that she'd moved on, that dredging it up would only make things worse. So I did what was easiest. I said nothing. Now, sitting in that same house 20 years later, I finally understood what my silence had cost. I hadn't just ruined Rosa's life. I'd given her daughter a reason to hate mine. At 11 p.m., I picked up the phone and dialed the one person who had always known the truth, even when I didn't want to face it. When Harold Pierce answered, his voice calm and steady, I could barely speak. "Harold," I said, my voice shaking, "I need you to find someone for me. Rosa Martinez, the woman I fired in 2005. Find out what happened to her. It's urgent." I took a breath that felt like glass in my throat, because I think I destroyed her life, and I think her daughter just married my son for revenge. After I hung up, I barely slept. I kept picturing that little girl from the photograph, the one laughing with Daniel in the summer sun. Now that same girl had grown into the woman who stood beside him at the altar, the woman who smiled as he called me the old hag who paid for everything. The guilt was unbearable. For 15 years, I'd thought I was protecting my family's dignity. Now I realized I had destroyed another family's life. 2 days later, Pierce called back. His voice was calm as always, but I could hear something different in it. Hesitation, pity, maybe even a trace of anger. "Maggie," he said quietly. "I found her. Or rather, what happened to her." I sat at my kitchen table with a pen in hand, as if I could take notes and turn this into something logical, manageable. But his words came like blows. Rosa Martinez died on November 3rd, 2014. Liver cancer. She was 47. I froze. The pen slipped from my fingers. According to hospital records, she was admitted 3 times in her final year, but couldn't afford treatment. No insurance, no legal status. After you fired her, she worked under the table, house cleaning, laundromat, kitchen helper. Her daughter dropped out of community college in 2013. Financial hardship. She worked 3 jobs from 17 to 20, waitress at Denny's, night janitor, weekend nanny. I checked employment tax filings. It's all there. He paused, and I could hear the weight in his breathing. In 2017, she disappeared from all records. Reappeared a year later under a new name, Emily Catherine Ross. Legal name change filed with the county clerk. She became a citizen through her mother's VEUA petition years earlier. Medical records show rhinoplasty and minor facial reconstruction procedures in 2018. Maggie. That girl spent 4 years working herself to the bone just to erase who she was. The surgery alone cost $8,000. When he finished, I couldn't speak. I just sat there staring at the window, the reflection of my own face looking like someone else's. "She built her new life from the ashes of mine," I whispered finally. "But she did it because I took everything from hers." That afternoon, I drove to Daniel's apartment. I didn't tell Pierce or Helen. I needed to face her alone. It was nearly 2 in the afternoon when I arrived. The building was quiet, expensive, sterile. I knocked once, twice. When the door opened, Emily stood there in a gray robe, her hair unbrushed, her face bare. For the first time, she looked her age, or maybe younger. "What do you want?" she said flatly. "I think you know why I'm here," I replied. "You're Rosa's daughter. Rosa Martinez. Aren't you?" The silence stretched. For 10 long seconds, she just looked at me. Then she laughed, a dry, bitter sound that didn't reach her eyes. "It took you 15 years to figure it out," she said quietly. 15 years. She stepped aside, gesturing toward the living room. "You know what? Come in. Let's talk about this properly." Daniel wasn't home. The apartment smelled faintly of coffee and perfume. She moved slowly, like someone who hadn't slept in days. 2 mugs sat on the counter. She poured coffee into both her hands, trembling. "I was 8 years old," she began, voice low, controlled, "when you fired my mother. I remember standing outside your house watching her cry. She begged you to check one more time. You wouldn't even look her in the eye. You called the police while I was standing right there." Her lips trembled, but her tone remained steady. "We lost everything that day. Not just her job, her reputation. No one would hire her after that. Word spreads fast in a small community, doesn't it? Rosa the thief. That's what they called her." She looked down, twisting the mug between her hands. "We moved 6 times in 3 years. I watched my mother clean toilets for $7 an hour. I watched her skip meals so I could eat. When she got sick in 2013, we couldn't afford doctors. She died slowly, painfully in a county hospital. She was 47. I was 17. I tried to speak, but no words came. After she died, Emily went on. I was homeless for 2 months. slept in my car, a 1998 Honda Civic that barely ran. I worked at Denny's from 6 to 2, cleaned offices from 3 to 11, nannied on weekends. For 4 years, I saved every single dollar I could. $18,000 in total. Do you know what I did with it? I shook my head, my throat too tight to answer. I bought myself a new life. $8,000 for surgery so I wouldn't look like the poor Mexican girl anymore. $500 for the legal name change. $2,000 for community college courses so I could network with rich people. $3,000 for consignment store clothes that looked expensive. The rest went to first month's rent and deposit in this city. And then she said, eyes locking on mine, I found Daniel. I researched him for 6 months. I knew his gym, his coffee shop, his routine. I didn't meet him by chance. The dating app was just the door I built to walk through. I wanted him to fall in love with me. I wanted to stand in the house you built in the family you protected and make you see what you did. Her voice broke, and for the first time she looked less like an enemy and more like that child in the photograph again. But somewhere along the way, she whispered, I started to care for him. I didn't plan to. It just happened. That was never supposed to be part of it. Tears burned behind my eyes. My voice came out barely audible. The necklace, I said slowly, the one my husband gave me. I found it a year later, behind the dresser. It fell. Your mother never stole it. Emily froze. Her entire body went still, as if the words had struck her physically. The color drained from her face. The mug slipped from her hand, hitting the tile floor and shattering coffee, splattering across her bare feet. What? Did you just say she whispered? That was the last thing Emily said to me before I left her apartment, leaving the broken mug, the spilled coffee, and years of buried guilt between us. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Her face, shocked, pale, trembling, haunted me. For the first time since Richard's death, I saw myself through another person's eyes and hated what I saw. I had destroyed a woman's life, and the echo of that injustice had circled back into mine in the form of her daughter. The irony was cruel, almost biblical. For days afterward, I moved like a ghost around my house. The air felt heavy, the silence punishing. Daniel didn't call, and I didn't try to reach him. I told myself I needed space, but truthfully, I was afraid to face what I'd done, what I'd allowed to fester between us all. When Pierce called 2 days later and told me what he'd found, I sat in my kitchen and cried until I thought my chest would split open. Rosa Martinez was gone. Emily, or Rosa Jr., had been living on ashes. There was no fixing that. All I could do now was try to honor the truth. 2 months later, on June 20th, 2025, the 15th anniversary of Richard's death, I decided to host a small memorial service at St. Andrew's Church, the same place where Richard and I were married 40 years ago. The church was old, filled with the smell of cedar and candle wax. I'd chosen to keep the gathering intimate, 30 guests, mostly family, and a few of Richard's closest friends. The pews creaked softly as people settled in. At the front stood a framed photograph of Richard Young, smiling with that confident light in his eyes. I hadn't seen that smile in 15 years, and yet it still filled the room with something unspoken. Daniel arrived late, looking nothing like the man who had once walked down the aisle in a designer tuxedo. He was thinner, his face hollowed, dark circles shadowing his eyes. He didn't meet my gaze as he sat down in the second pew. Behind him, to my quiet surprise, was Emily. She wore black, her hair pulled back neatly, her face unreadable. She didn't sit beside him. For a moment, I wondered if I'd made a mistake inviting her. But no, this was her story too, whether she wanted it or not. When the priest finished his brief opening prayer, I rose from my seat and walked to the front. My voice felt small at first, but steadied as I spoke. Thank you all for coming to remember Richard. He was a man who loved deeply and planned carefully. Before he passed, he left something behind, something I was told to share only if certain conditions were met. I turned toward Pierce, who sat near the front with a worn leather briefcase on his lap. He nodded, rising with a solemn expression that made the air shift in the room. Richard Holt, he began, didn't just leave a will. He left a series of messages, a guide, if you will, for multiple futures. He wanted to be prepared for whatever path his family took. The whispers began at once. Pierce opened the briefcase and drew out a small titanium safe. The metal glinted under the soft church light, heavy with meaning. Inside, he said, are 7 USB drives, each one labeled with a number. Each one corresponds to a scenario Richard envisioned paths Daniel's life might take. My heart thudded so hard I could feel it in my throat. I had known about this in theory, but seeing it there, 7 futures neatly sealed in numbered capsules, made me realize how well Richard had known us all, even after death. Pierce unfolded a yellowed letter, his voice tightening as he read. To Harold Pierce, instructions for selection. Harold, my old friend, if you're reading this, I'm gone. You've been watching Daniel for me. I paid you a 20-year retainer to observe his life quietly, to record his choices. Now it's time to choose which message to play. You'll know which one fits. Daniel's head snapped up, confusion and fear flickering across his face. You've been watching me, he demanded, but Pierce didn't answer. Instead, he reached into the safe and lifted out the 5th drive. Scenario number 5, he said slowly. When Daniel marries for money and disrespects his mother publicly. A collective gasp rippled through the pews. I heard someone's breath hit sharply behind me. Emily's hands folded neatly in her lap, tightened visibly. My legs felt weak, but I forced myself to stand firm as Pierce inserted the drive into the laptop on the small table near the altar. The screen above the pulpit flickered to life, filling the sanctuary with a cold white light. For a long moment, there was only static. And then Richard's face appeared, older, thinner, but unmistakably him. His eyes were sharp, knowing, filled with that same mixture of love and disappointment I'd seen 100 times before. He looked directly into the camera, directly at Daniel. Hello, Daniel, he said quietly. If you're watching this, then you've made a choice I prayed you'd never make. Let me tell you about my brother Thomas. When Richard's voice filled the church, the years between us seemed to dissolve. It was 2010 again, and I was sitting beside him in that hospital room holding his frail hand, refusing to accept that time was running out. But now his voice wasn't meant for me, it was meant for our son. The video flickered slightly, showing Richard, thinner than most, remembered his skin pale, but his eyes alive with that same steadiness that had carried our family through every storm. Daniel, he said, I had a brother Thomas. He was successful, charming, well-liked. But when our mother grew old, he began to see her as a burden. He made jokes about her memory, her age, even her hands when they trembled at dinner. Then he convinced her to sign her house over to him for estate purposes. When she fell ill, he sent her to the cheapest nursing home and never visited again. She died alone, calling his name. I glanced toward Daniel. His head was bowed, his face buried in his hands. Richard paused in the video, wiping at tears. I swore I'd never let that happen to Maggie, so I made sure she would be protected. And I asked Harold to help me build something 7 possible futures. I didn't do it to punish you, son. I did it to prepare for the man you might become. I could hear the quiet sob of someone in the back row. Even Emily, sitting alone, seemed frozen. The camera in the video zoomed closer to Richard's face as his tone shifted. But there's something else you need to know, he said. In 2005, we fired a housekeeper named Rosa Martinez. Your mother thought she stole her diamond necklace, and I supported that decision. But a year later, I found the necklace behind our bedroom dresser. Rosa never stole anything. My breath caught in my throat. Even though I knew what was coming, hearing it in his voice from beyond the grave was almost unbearable. Richard looked down his shoulders, trembling. I tried to find her, Daniel. I hired a private investigator, but she was gone. Probably too ashamed to stay in town. So I set aside $200,000 in a trust marked for Rosa Martinez, or her descendants, as restitution. Harold's been searching for her ever since. Then he leaned forward, his face filling the screen. If any member of the Martinez family is watching this now, I am deeply sorry. We wronged you. This money is yours with no conditions. Take it as an apology that came too late. Emily's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't move. I wanted to reach for her to say something, anything, but my body wouldn't respond. Then Richard took a deep breath and turned back toward Daniel. Now about your inheritance, he said. You're probably wondering if you've lost everything. The truth is, I don't decide that. Your mother does. I gave her a life estate, all assets are hers while she's alive. When she dies, they can pass to you, but only if Harold determines that you've shown her genuine respect and care. And even then, Maggie can overrule him. She has the final say. The church seemed to hold its breath as Richard leaned closer to the camera. Your inheritance isn't money, Daniel. It's your mother's forgiveness. And forgiveness isn't something you can demand or buy. It's something you earn every day. I've given your mother the power I wish I'd given mine. The question is, what will you do with the time you have left? The video ended there. The screen went black. For several seconds, no one moved. I heard the faint hum of the projector fan and the beating of my own heart. Then Pierce stood and said softly, "There's one more envelope, marked 5B for any Martinez family member present." He looked directly at Emily. I remember the sounds of paper against paper as Pierce opened his briefcase again. The room was so silent I could hear my own heartbeat. He reached inside and pulled out a thick cream-colored envelope, its edges slightly yellowed with age. This, he said, was sealed in 2010. It's addressed to Rosa Martinez or her legal descendant. He held it out toward Emily. Her fingers trembled as she accepted it. For a moment, she just stared at it like she was afraid to open it, afraid that something sacred or painful would escape once she did. Then, with a shaky breath, she tore the seal. The paper inside crackled softly as she unfolded it. I could see her lips move as she read silently, her eyes scanning each line, her expression shifting from disbelief to devastation. A check slipped from between the folds and fluttered to the floor. Pierce bent to pick it up and read aloud. Dated May 12, 2010. Payable to Rosa Martinez Sr. or legal descendant. Amount $200,000. He placed it gently back in Emily's hands. Her voice broke when she finally spoke. He tried to find us, she whispered. He tried to fix it. All these years, I thought, none of you cared. I thought my mother died thinking no one ever believed her. Her shoulders shook as she wept the first real tears I'd seen from her. I wanted to reach for her to tell her I was sorry again, but before I could move, Daniel stood abruptly. His voice cracked like glass. I knew. Everyone turned. I knew about the will, Mom. My body went cold. What did you say? I asked quietly. He took out his phone with shaking hands and swiped to a photo. An image of Richard's will, the clause about respect and forfeiture clearly visible. The timestamp read, January 2022. I found it in Dad's desk 2 years ago, he said. I read it. I knew about the clause, and I didn't tell you." His voice broke as he continued. "Emily saw it on my phone one night. She said you'd never really enforce it. She said no mother could ever disown her only son. She said we should test you to prove that your love was unconditional." He pressed a hand against his chest, his breathing uneven. "That's why I said it at the wedding, the old hag thing. It wasn't random, Mom. It was a test. I thought if I said something cruel and you still forgave me, it would mean Dad was wrong, that love was stronger than pride. I thought—" His voice trailed off as tears ran down his face. "I thought you'd never actually read the will." My knees weakened. I felt the church tilt around me as though gravity itself had shifted. Before I could speak, Emily rose from her seat, her eyes wild with fury and pain. "You knew," she shouted. "You knew, and you still did it." She looked at him as though seeing him for the first time. "You had everything, Daniel. A mother who adored you, a father who protected you, money, security. And you threw it all away because you wanted to test her." Her voice cracked under the weight of disbelief. "I wanted revenge because I had nothing. You wanted it because you were bored." She pulled off her wedding ring, her hand trembling. "Mrs. Holt, you were wrong to fire my mother, but at least you had an excuse. You thought she stole something." "He has no excuse." She dropped the ring onto the pew. It clinked softly, a sound sharper than any scream, and then she walked down the aisle and out of the church without looking back. Daniel fell to his knees where she'd stood. "Mom," he choked out. "Mom, please, I don't care about the money. I don't care about the house. I just want my mom back." I looked down at him. His face wet, broken, the boy I once rocked to sleep now kneeling before me like a stranger. My throat ached as I whispered, "Your father said I hold the key to your inheritance." "But Daniel—" "Some doors once closed can never be opened the same way again." I thought those words would be the last I'd ever say to him. After that day at the church, I closed the door literally and figuratively. I stopped answering his calls, deleted his messages without reading them, and let the silence grow between us. I told myself it was what he needed, that sometimes love meant letting someone live with the echo of their mistakes. But in truth, I was tired. My body was failing me faster than I could admit, and I no longer had the strength to carry both my sickness and my son's remorse. By August, the summer heat hung heavy over Maple Street, and I was thinner than I had ever been. My hands trembled even when I tried to hold a cup of tea. I'd told no one except Pierce about my diagnosis. Pancreatic cancer, stage 4. The doctors had given me 6 to 9 months back in January, maybe a year if I tolerated treatment. I'd already exceeded their predictions, though I didn't know if that was a blessing or a punishment. The chemo sessions had become routine white walls, the smell of antiseptic, the low hum of machines. I brought books I rarely read more for the comfort of having something to hold than for the words themselves. That afternoon, August 12th, the nurse had just adjusted my IV when I heard quick footsteps in the hallway, urgent, uneven. Then the door burst open. Daniel stood there, his face pale, his breath ragged. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. I simply looked at him the way you look at a ghost you once knew. He looked smaller somehow, stripped of the arrogance and easy confidence that used to define him. "You found out," I said quietly, closing my book. He nodded, eyes wide, glistening. "Mom, why didn't you tell me?" "How long have you—" His voice broke before he could finish. "I was diagnosed in January," I said simply. 3 months before your wedding." His hands flew to his face. 3 months before. You knew you were dying, and you still came, paid for everything, and He couldn't finish. His voice collapsed under the weight of it. The doctors gave me 6 to 9 months. I continued my tone, even. Maybe 12 with aggressive treatment. I've been doing chemo every 2 weeks since February. That's why I looked tired at the rehearsal dinner. Not because I was old or fragile, like Emily said. Because I was sick. He sank to his knees beside my chair, clutching my arm like a child. Mom, please. Why didn't you tell me? If I'd known, I would have been there. I would have helped with your treatments. I cut him off gently. That's exactly why I didn't tell you, Daniel. If you had known, you would have been perfect. You would have called every day, brought soup, driven me here. You would have said all the right things, and I would have died not knowing if you did it out of love or guilt or fear of losing your inheritance. He looked up at me, stricken, his lips trembling. I continued, though my voice wavered. I wanted one last chance to see who you were when you thought I'd live forever, when there was no urgency, no deadline forcing your kindness. And what I saw. I took a slow, painful breath. You chose a woman who despised me. You mocked me in front of 200 people. You proved that without fear of loss, I meant nothing to you. He sobbed openly now, his head against my lap. I let him cry, my hand resting lightly on his hair, the way I used to when he was small. How much time do you have left? He whispered finally. The doctors are surprised I'm still here, I said softly. 11 months since the diagnosis. They call it a remarkable will to live. But I think Richard's keeping me here until I figure out what to do with you. The words hung between us, sharp and quiet. My hand trembled as I reached for my bag beside the chair. Inside was a worn, sealed envelope, yellowed with age, the handwriting unmistakably Richard's. I held it out to him. Your father left you one more thing, I said. A letter. He told me to give it to you only if you earned it. I don't think you have. But he'd want you to read it anyway. Maybe it will help you understand what love actually means. Daniel opened the envelope right there beside my hospital bed. His hands shook so badly that I had to steady them. He unfolded the letter carefully, the paper thin and yellowed, Richard's handwriting still strong and certain, even after all these years. He read in silence, lips moving slightly, as though repeating the words to himself. I watched him, remembering the little boy who used to sit cross-legged on the floor, reading comic books aloud, just to make me laugh. But this time there was no laughter, only quiet tears, as his father's words reached him from the grave. My son Richard had written, "If you're reading this, it means you've hurt your mother deeply. Deeply enough that she wonders if she should cut you out of her life entirely. I want you to know I forgive you. Not because what you did is okay, but because I believe people can change. The difference between your Uncle Thomas and me is that I was willing to face my failures. You must now decide which of us you'll be. You can blame your mother, your wife, or me, or you can look in the mirror and admit I failed. I hurt someone who loved me unconditionally. The work of becoming better will take years, not weeks. It requires humility, not grand gestures. Show up for her even if she never forgives you. Do it because it's right. Your mother is the strongest person I've ever known. Be her strength now. I love you, son. Now go love her." When he finished, Daniel folded the letter, pressed it to his chest, and wept quietly. I didn't speak. Some lessons needed silence. 8 months later, winter returned to Maple Street. Against every prognosis, I was still here, thinner, weaker, but alive. The doctors called it remarkable. I called it Richard's stubbornness living on in me. Daniel had changed. Truly changed. He'd taken a job at the Holt Family Foundation, the nonprofit I'd started with part of our estate, to help single mothers fighting cancer and children of families like Rose's. He didn't use his name. He introduced himself as Dan Richards, volunteering 6 days a week, driving patients to chemo, delivering meals, tutoring kids after school. I never asked him to. He never asked for forgiveness. He simply showed up. Every evening around 6, I'd hear the soft clink of Tupperware on my porch. A note always accompanied it. Dinner. Made your favorite pot roast. D. I never replied, but I ate every meal. The food tasted like something old and familiar, a time when love was simple and unspoken. By December, the air was crisp and sharp. I sat in the garden one evening watching the sun fade behind the bare trees. Daniel was out back watering the plants, even though the ground was half frozen. He'd been doing that for months. I finally called his name. Daniel. He turned nervous as though expecting another lecture. Come sit with me. We sat in silence for a while. The sky glowed a deep orange, the kind that made you believe time could pause if you just wished hard enough. I spoke with Harold yesterday, I said finally, about the will. He started to protest, but I raised my hand. Let me finish. I told him I'm not restoring your inheritance. When I die, everything goes to the foundation. You'll inherit nothing. His shoulders trembled, but he nodded. I understand, he whispered. I don't deserve it. I studied his face, the humility there, the quiet steadiness that hadn't been there before. But I continued softly. I'm putting you on the board of directors. Not as my son. As someone who's earned the right to serve others. You'll have a modest salary enough to live on. Your father would be proud of the man you're becoming. Tears welled in his eyes. Thank you, he said, voice breaking. I smiled faintly. Don't thank me yet. You still have to work with the other board member I appointed. He looked confused. Who? I let the answer hang for a moment before saying, Emily Martinez. She accepted your father's restitution. She's using half to start a scholarship fund for children of immigrant workers. I asked her to help run it with you. She said she'd think about it. The evening light deepened around us, gold turning to blue. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The cold air stung my lungs, but it felt good, clean. Somewhere inside the house, the kettle began to whistle. Daniel stood. I'll make us tea, he said quietly. And for the first time in almost a year, I reached out and touched his hand. Thank you, son. As he walked inside, I looked toward the foundation office across the street. A new wooden sign gleamed in the fading light. Holt Martinez Family Foundation. In memory of Richard James Holt and Rosa Maria Martinez. For those who remember love. Richard used to say that inheritance isn't what you leave your children, it's what you leave in them. That night, watching Daniel move around my kitchen like he did when he was 10, I finally understood. The money didn't matter. The house didn't matter. What mattered was this. He came back, not because he had to, but because he chose to. And maybe, just maybe, that's what Richard had planned all along. Not revenge, not punishment, but redemption for all of us. And that was the story of the old hag who paid for everything. A story not about wealth or revenge, but about how love can survive even the deepest wounds if we have the courage to face who we really are. Maggie's strength, Daniel's redemption, and Emily's forgiveness remind us that life doesn't always offer happy endings, but it does give us second chances if we're brave enough to take them. If this story touched your heart, if it made you think of your own family, your parents, or the power of forgiveness, I'd love to hear from you. Do you think Maggie did the right thing by keeping her illness secret? Do you believe Daniel truly earned redemption? Or was his mother too forgiving in the end? And what about Emily? Was her revenge justified? Or did pain blind her to what she might have become? Your thoughts and feelings matter because stories like this aren't just fiction. They're reflections of the choices we make and the love we sometimes take for granted. If you enjoyed this story, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel. Your support helps keep these stories alive and brings more tales of family love and redemption to those who need to hear them. And don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments below. I read every one of them. Tell me what moment stayed with you, what part made you stop and think, or what you would have done differently if you were in Maggie's place. Because in the end, the story doesn't end with Maggie, Daniel, or Emily. It continues with you. What would you do for forgiveness? What would you do for love?